Welcome to the East Central Regional Arts Council's grant information session for organizations. This info session is for our fiscal years 2022 through 2023. During this grant info session, I will be discussing information regarding the overview of the arts funding within the state of Minnesota, as well as the arts funding in East Central Minnesota, specific to the East Central Regional Arts Council. I'll also cover the fiscal year 22-23 programming that we have available to organizations and go into the specifics about each of those grants that we do have for organizations that are eligible to apply. I'm also going to cover some grant writing basics in regards to specific to the applications here at the East Central Regional Arts Council. Because this is a recording, of course, you won't be able to ask questions during this grant information session, but I would highly encourage you to reach out to us if you do have any questions after the grant info session has been completed. At any time, we are available to answer questions about our grant programs and services. The Minnesota Arts Funding System is a unique decentralized system of 11 regional arts councils across the state that disseminate state and other funding for local arts projects, artists, arts and education residencies, for arts organizations, and other local arts activities. On the map on the right, you can see our region is 7E. That region encompasses the counties of Chisago, Isani, Knebec, Mille Lacs, and Pine. We partner with the Minnesota State Arts Board to serve the nonprofit arts community. On November 4th, 2008, the voters of Minnesota approved a 25-year arts legacy for the state of Minnesota. This legacy was the Clean Water, Land, and Legacy Amendment. Minnesotans resoundingly passed the Clean Water, Land, and Legacy Amendment to the state constitution, and as a result, over a 25-year period, 3/8 of 1% of the state sales tax are dedicated 1/3 or 33% to a Clean Water Fund, 33% to the Outdoor Heritage Fund, and the final third is broken into two parts, 14.25% to Parks and Trails and 19.75% to Arts and Cultural Heritage. If you're curious about where the funding is going, you are welcome to visit the website here, www.legacy.leg.mn, and you'll find more information about the Clean Water, Land, and Legacy Amendment and how those funds are being used. Specific funding to the regional arts councils, we're funded through three sources of funding. We have funds from the McKnight Foundation, funds from the state of Minnesota's general fund, as well as the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, so the state of Minnesota's Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund that I just mentioned. The McKnight Foundation funds are two of our individual artist grants, the ECRAC Mid-Career Artist Grant and the Essential Artist Award. The state of Minnesota's general fund funds our Art in Our Schools grant, the Small Art Project grant, and we have a scholarship for K-12 students that it also funds. And then the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund is, we have three grants available with that funding: the Arts and Cultural Heritage Organization Art Project Grant, and then the Arts and Cultural Heritage Individual Artist Grant, and then we have a new grant, the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund Resiliency Grant for artists and art organizations. I'll go into more detail about each of these grants in just a little while, but these are the grants and the funding sources for them. You may know or may not know that we've actually been around for quite a long time. In July of 1979, the East Central Arts Council became a program of the East Central Regional Development Commission in Mora, Minnesota, the ECRDC. And in 2010, after working with a consultant and with much input from constituents, the decision was made at that time then for the Arts Council to leave the Regional Development Commission and become the new designated Regional Arts Council for this region, an independent nonprofit. So on July 1st, 2011, they moved their offices to Brand, Minnesota. And then again in 2020, we moved our offices now to Hinckley, Minnesota. So we are located in Hinckley at this time. The mission of the East Central Regional Arts Council is to support the arts and bring the life-enhancing values they afford to Region 7E residents. ECRAC accomplishes this mission through programs and special initiatives for artists and art organizations. So in other words, we're here to increase the arts. The vision statement of the East Central Regional Arts Council is that all Region 70 residents will have the opportunity to participate, appreciate, create, and invest in the arts. Their values include arts in action, integrity, artistic merit, and legacy. For arts in action, we are motivated by our love of the arts to serve artists and organizations with resources, education, and commitment. We welcome all artists and organizations as partners in our common goal of developing a vibrant arts community. Integrity. We recognize all art forms and act with consistency, support, and respect in all of our relationships and in our stewardship of the resources entrusted to us. Artistic merit. We uphold a high standard of artistic quality that promotes growth and development of creative knowledge, skills, and understanding. Legacy. We understand and appreciate that the arts are an essential part of our heritage and daily lives. We uphold the creative spirit from the past, in the present, and into the future. The East Central Regional Arts Council, some of the things that we provide are grants to artists, of course, arts and other nonprofit organizations, as well as educational institutions and local units of government. We provide technical assistance. I'll go into more detail about technical assistance later on. We also offer workshops and referral services to art organizations and artists, and we also coordinate the arts regional needs assessment and the subsequent arts plan for the region. Here is our current board members as of December 2021. Pat Black from Pine County, Marianne Cleary from Isani County, Angela Ruddy from Isani County, Deanne Sibley from Isani County, and Carla Vita from Mille Lacs County. We do have vacancies, so if you know of anyone who may be a good fit as a board member, or you yourself may be interested in becoming a board member, please reach out to us. We can share the information on how to apply. One thing to know about the board members is make sure that if you are applying for a grant with us, you don't want to lobby them for your grant project because it does make your application ineligible. Okay, a little bit more about the programs we have available for organizations and the amounts and their deadlines. The Art in Our Schools grant, this grant is specific to schools and it is for $3,000. This grant has 3 deadline dates in fiscal year 22 and 23 of October 1st, February 1st, and April 1st. We also have a small art project assistance grant. This grant is for $500 to $5,000 and again has those same 3 deadline dates of October 1st, February 1st, and April 1st. And then the ECRAC Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund Art Project Grant. This grant is for $5,000 to $15,000. Again, with that same deadlines of October 1st, February 1st, and April 1st. And then we also have the ECRAC Essentials Grant. This was formerly known as the General Operating Grant. This grant is specific to arts organizations that are located in our region, and the amounts range between $3,000 to $5,000 for that request. This has 1 deadline each year on March 1st. And then a new grant that we added recently was the ECRAC Resiliency Grant for artists and art organizations. This grant is for $600 and has an ongoing deadline, so this grant can be applied for at any time. Other services that we have or items that are available to organizations include equipment in your grant Other items that can be included in a grant application with us, with the programming, is equipment purchases if you're a nonprofit organization. Organization administrative costs in support of a project can be included in your grant application. There is a 10% cash match requirement for organizations when they apply for a grant with us. I'll go into a little bit more detail about that in just a little while for each of the grants and the specifics, but at least a 10% cash match is required. Make sure that if you're applying for a grant project with us, it is not supplanting existing sources of funding for your organization. And just know that when you apply for a grant or when you have a grant with us, that you also are you must carefully track all expenses with the grant. So during the grant project period, any proof of payment or receipts that are result of the project must be saved by your organization. Other ECRAC services that we have available include the Essential Arts e-newsletter. If you're not on our newsletter, feel free to sign up. There is a link on our website at the bottom of the page. You can enter your email address. The newsletter is super helpful. It just lets you know we send out maybe one a month, or when something's happening, maybe when a deadline date is coming up, or if there's a workshop or information that we want to share with our arts community. That newsletter can be super helpful. We also have the ECRAC gallery space. Now that in our new space here in Hinckley, we have a beautiful gallery space where you're welcome to come visit. We have a permanent art collection that we hang there when we don't have a show. That's is another possibility in our gallery space. That we have an art show at least once a year. We have resource information available on our website. There are links to multiple resources for the arts community. Here, even if it's not there, it's possible if we have a conversation and you call us, we can share resource information. We have economic development information specific to the state of Minnesota and as well as local counties. We have an arts library. We offer workshops for artists and for organizations. Grant information sessions like this, we do them in person on Zoom, and of course the recording now. We have grant writing technical assistance. Grant writing technical assistance includes review of a rough draft of your application. If you're interested in that, what we'll do is read through your application and give you feedback on the application, maybe sharing tips on maybe a part of your application where more information may be needed, or we will check all of your attachments with your application to make sure they open okay and that they can be seen by reviewers. If there's anything in your application that we can give you feedback on, we'll do that, and that's part of the grant writing technical assistance. If you're having technical issues with your application, that's something else that we will help you with. If you're having trouble uploading documents, all of that is included. We have art show display equipment rental available, so if you are having or hosting an art show and you don't have enough display equipment, there's a possibility that our equipment will work for you, so that is available for rent. We have the annual image art show that we host once a year, and occasionally other art shows will also be included in our gallery space. Our gallery space is also available for meetings and arts events. We have a past grant application library available, so if you're interested in reviewing past applications or successful applications that have been approved, you can make an appointment to come into our office and review those hard copies of those applications. Remote office hours, we will occasionally, if you keep your eye out on our calendar, there are opportunities where we'll be out in the community and making ourselves available to meet with you one-on-one or with your group to talk about our grant services or a grant project idea you may have. Those are remote office hours. And then we also have referrals to other services if they're needed. Maybe there's a question you have that we don't have a resource for, but we know another organization that does. So we'll do our best to help. Some things to consider when you are applying for a grant with the East Central Regional Arts Council is just to know that it's not free money and there is a lot of paperwork involved in our applications. They are quite long and there are a lot of attachments that we require from you. Your entire project must be planned before you apply for a grant with us. There's the need for proof of payment throughout the process. There's a final report that you submit at the end of the project. There's a possibility of public scrutiny. All of these things are something to keep in mind when you are working on an application with us. If your grant project isn't a good fit for our applications, we'll help you figure that out. You're welcome to give us a call. We'd be happy to talk about your project idea, how it might fit into our grant applications, and which application may be the best fit for your project. All of that is a phone call away, so feel free to reach out to us or send us an email if you're thinking of applying for a grant. But just know that this is some information to think about, and perhaps there are other resources for funding that might work better for your grant project if our application or our grant programs aren't a good fit. Some new things that have changed. If you've applied with us in the past for a grant project, or if you've had a grant with us in the past, this is just some information to know about that is going to be new. Our individual artist grant is now the ECRAC Mid-Career Artist Grant and has increased from $1,000 to $2,500. If you happen to know any artists who may be interested in applying for a grant with us, this is just good information to share or for them to know as well. The Arts and Cultural Heritage Individual Artist Grant has decreased from $2,500 to $1,000. And our Essential Artist Award has increased from $7,000 to $8,000. And then also the ECRAC Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund Resiliency Grant. This is a new grant, as I've mentioned. The remote office hours that are available, this is also something that's new that we've added. You can always check our website calendar for updates on where we'll be. ECRAC's art gallery space is available to individual artists as well as organizations for meetings and arts events. So that's something that's new we've added for the use of our space. ECRAC for organizations highly recommends having at least one board member from Region 7E or an advisory committee member from Region 7E. So if your organization does not have any board members or advisory representatives from Region 7E, you're going to need to make sure that you include it in your application narrative why you don't have those representatives. It is of high value to our board that your board members represent our region. The grant guidelines and the grant review criteria have changed slightly, so I will always recommend that when you're applying for a grant with us to review those grant guidelines before you start your application. Pay attention to the review criteria. The guidelines are designed to work perfectly with the application, so as you're filling out those questions, you can reference the guidelines, and they will explain in more detail what the application needs. We also, something new for organizations is we are looking for work samples from the artists that you'll be working with your application. So there is a section in the application now where you can upload, if you're hiring a musician for, or working with a musician or a band, you can upload a video of them performing. Or if you're working with a visual artist, you can upload work samples of their visual works. So that's something that's new in our applications. We've also revised the budget templates with our applications. We've done our best, hopefully, to simplify that budget template for you when you're filling that out. And I'll go into the budget template later on in the grant information session as well. Okay, grant writing basics. One of the first things I like to talk about is that when you apply for a grant with us, if you're not funded the first time that you apply, I highly recommend reapplying. If you're not funded, try again. It's not personal. The most important thing for a grant writer to remember is that you could submit a perfect application and still not be approved. There is limited resources to fund projects, so it's possible that the funding for that particular grant program has just run out and we are no longer able to fund any more applications. It could also be something simple as maybe an attachment that you included in your application that we couldn't open it, or it was damaged and the board isn't able to score your application then without that information, if it was a key piece of your application. So there's all sorts of reasons that an application may not be funded the first time. We are happy to work with you after a grant review has occurred and share with you the feedback from the grant reviewers, what they had to say about your application, so that you can maybe make updates to your project and your future application when you reapply. So we are happy to do that for you and give you any advice that we can. Okay, if you're applying for a grant with us as an organization, these are just some of the requirements. You must be an organization located in Region 7E. You must or need to be either a public agency or organization such as a local unit of government, an independent school district or tribal government, or a Minnesota private nonprofit organization that has obtained a 501c3 tax-exempt status under the IRS and is registered with the Minnesota Secretary of State and Department of Revenue. You could also be a group of 3 or more members using a fiscal agent that fits one of the categories that I've just listed above. You must not have any unacceptable or outstanding reports due to ECRAC. For example, if you have applied or received a grant from us in the past and you never completed or submitted your final report for that grant project, your organization is ineligible for funding until you work with us and submit that final report and the board approves you to reapply for future grants. You also must not have any misuse of funds determinations with the Minnesota State Arts Board or any other regional arts councils. And you must have an open to the public and accessible event with your grant project. If you're an organization applying for a grant with us, that is a requirement for all of our grant applications, that there is a community component where the public is invited. Another item that is important to include in your application is that your grant project must include an outcome evaluation plan. This is going to be specific to your art project and your organization, what those outcomes that you're going to be looking for through the project, but the application has a full section on outcome evaluations, and the grant guidelines go into detail about what those outcomes, what choices or options there are for outcome evaluations. Before you begin an application with us, make sure, of course, that you're an eligible applicant. Make sure you're applying for an art project. That seems very obvious, but I will show you shortly a list of what is approved as art projects, and it's very, very inclusive. So lots of things are considered art. But just make sure that when you're applying, that you are applying for an art project. If it's helpful, make sure you have a planning team, brainstorm and research, visualize possibilities of what you could do with grant funding. And for the project, having that team in place is going to be helpful when you're putting your application together and gathering all of the extra materials that you need. You can call us to make sure funds are available for a grant that you are applying for. At the first deadline date of every year, October 1st, is when we'll most likely have all of our funding for the year. But as we approach the third deadline of the year of April 1st, it is possible that we've expended all of the funds and approved all of the grant applications that we have funding available for. So feel free to check with us. You're welcome to do that. As I've mentioned already, make sure you're reading through the grant guidelines and the instructions very thoroughly. Also, I would recommend paying attention to the What ECRAC Can't Fund section of the guidelines. If any part of your project that you're applying for falls under one of these items that we can't fund, your application is going to be ineligible. So I would just review those items, make sure that everything that you are applying for in your project is an eligible grant funded piece to your project. Everything is online when you apply for a grant with us, so you'll need to create an online grant portal to begin your application if your organization hasn't already created one. So if your organization has applied with us in the past, you'll just need to reach out to make sure you have that login and password information for the organization. And you are able to set up different users under an organization, so we can help you with that if there's a need, or if you think your organization has a login already but you're not sure, feel free to just reach out to us and we can certainly look that up and help you out with that. Okay, what is art? As I mentioned, we believe art is very inclusive, and there are a lot of things that that we would consider art. So just ways that art can be described is a study of a creative skill, a process of using the creative skill, a product of the creative skill, or your audience's experiences with that creative skill. The Minnesota State Arts Boards and the Regional Arts Councils define arts very inclusively. They are activities resulting in the artistic creation or artistic performance of works of the imagination. These activities include the disciplines that follow as defined by the National Endowment for the Arts. So this next slide, I will show you the list of those art disciplines. But when you're applying for a grant with us, again, as I've mentioned, make sure your proposal is for an art project. If we tell you that it's questionable as an art project, it probably is. But here is that list. If you would like to look through this list, feel free to pause this video at the moment and you can read exactly which all of these art disciplines are. You can also reference this list on our website and in the application. Okay, getting into some more grant writing basics. Everything, as I mentioned, is found through our website. So you can go to ecrac.org and there is a page for each of the separate grant programs that we have available. And on each of those pages, you'll find links to the grant guidelines. You'll find a link to the grant application questions, a PDF that just shows you what those questions are before you log into the grant portal. There are other links available or items and information that may be helpful as you're putting together your application, all through our website. You'll also find the grant portal link where you'll actually go into the grant portal to apply for a grant. When you're applying for a grant with us, the grant portal applications are available 4 to 6 weeks before the deadline date. So if you are applying October 1st, you have approximately a month before the deadline to work on your application, a month to maybe a little bit more than a month. Make sure all items on the grant application are completed and file uploads are in the correct format when you submit your application. So all of the grant application questions when you're working on the application have asterisks next to the required questions. There is space in the applications to upload additional documentation that we request with the application. You just want to make sure that those uploads that you're adding are compatible with the grant portal. So for example, if you happen to be a Mac user, any of the Mac files, such as pages, are not compatible with the grant portal. So if you were to upload a document, a pages document, into the application, we're not able to open that and view it. So this is just an example of where we would highly recommend converting all of your files to a PDF before you upload them into the document so that they are viewable. But this is something that if you're working with us beforehand and request a grant writing technical assistance or a review of your rough draft of your application, we'll look for things like this and let you know that those files and attachments that you're including in your application are viewable and that we can open them successfully to review them along with your application. So just a thing to check out. You can also, as an applicant, create a PDF of your entire application, and within that PDF, they'll tell you if there's errors in your application. So that's another tip on checking out to make sure all of your uploads are viewable by us, is to create a PDF of your application. Scroll through that entire PDF, and at the end section, it lets you know if all of your attachments are there and if there's any errors. Okay, when you're applying for grant, know how your project fits the grant program criteria and the guidelines. Again, this is just a tip to let you know that when you're working on your application, have the guidelines accessible right along with your application so that the guidelines and instructions are right there handy. They will walk you through or share with you all the information you need to know when you're applying for a grant with us. So the grant review criteria is there. Think about or consider that criteria when you're putting your narrative together for each of the questions. Make sure your application certification page is signed both by the project director and an authorized organization representative and is uploaded as a PDF. So the certification page is included in the application as a PDF. You'll open up that certification page, and it can be an electronic signature, but it can also be a wet signature if you want to print the certification page and sign it and then scan and upload it into the application is fine. But make sure that there are 2 separate signatures, not the same person signing this document twice. The project director cannot also be the authorized organization representative. So you want to have your project director's signature on this and then an organization representative who is authorized to sign documents for your organization, putting their signature on the document. What else? Grant reviewers, just know that your grant application is all that they can consider when they're reviewing your application. They will read the material that you're included with your application. They score your application based on everything that you've submitted with the application. They're unable to review additional material that you may consider or include in your narrative, such as a website. So for example, if you're working with a band or a musician or a group and you say, here's a link to their website to go check them out, the board members cannot click on that website and go look at their the information that you want them to see. If you want them to have information about that band, you want to take a screenshot of that band's website, have an artistic resume of that band, and put that information as a document and attach it to the application. That's how the board is going to know what exactly you want them to know about that band and the specific information or reason why you are working with this artist can be included in your narrative. So So keep that in mind, that you don't want to include any unasked for items in your proposal. Answer the questions that are in the application and upload the information that we're requesting throughout the application, and you should be good to go. Submit your application on time. This is, again, seems kind of like an obvious thing, but just for your information, when you're applying for a grant with us, let's, for example, say you're going to submit a grant at our February 1st deadline. You have until 11:59 p.m. on February 1st to submit your application. So you can work on your application on February 1st and hit that submit button on that same day. I don't recommend waiting until too long or too close to 11:59 p.m. If you, for example, have not answered one of the required questions in the application, it does not allow you to submit your application. So if you're getting close to that 11:59 p.m. Time on the clock and you try to submit your application and find that it's not allowing you to submit it, it's possible then that you won't have enough time. So I don't recommend waiting until that far out, but you certainly can submit it at 11:59 and it will be eligible. But as soon as we get into 12 o'clock, it's no longer eligible. And then, as I've kind of already mentioned, just make sure you are including all of the extra information that we're requesting in the application as attachments. If you convert them to a PDF, that's what we recommend, that all documents that you upload into the application is a PDF. Review those PDFs before you upload them to make sure that it's, all of the information is there and that the page isn't cut off, or that you or maybe that it's the correct document that you're uploading. So those are things just, again, to keep in mind as you're working on an application for the Regional Arts Council. Okay, grant deadlines for organizations. This table is going to be useful for you when you're working on your grant application, or when you're planning ahead for when you're going to apply for a grant with us. This table is in all of our grant guidelines too, so if you want to reference it again, it's going to be in the grant guidelines, but I'll just walk through each of these columns and kind of go over what these dates mean. So first column, technical assistance deadline. This is the date from you're guaranteed a review of your grant application before you submit it to us. So if you're applying October 1st, you have until September 20th to request a technical assistance or a grant review of your application, and you'll be guaranteed a review. We will still review applications up to October 1st, but just know that the closer we get to that deadline date, the less we can actually guarantee we have the time and availability to review an application. So it's just best to request it by this deadline date. However, I do recommend still reaching out to us after this date has passed, because it's possible we'll have time and we'll be able to still review an application. So don't let that deter you from asking or requesting for an application review. But and then, of course, the deadline date, like I mentioned, you have until 11:59 p.m. on that deadline date to submit your application. The final approved by date, this is when you'll hear from us whether your application was approved or not. We do invite you to the grant review, so you can hear on the night of the grant review if your application was approved or declined. So just know that that will happen, but you'll hear from us before this date if you don't attend the grant review. The earliest start date and the end dates, these last two columns, are going to be very important dates for you to consider when you're planning an application with us. The earliest start date is the date that you can begin your project if it's approved through the Regional Arts Council. So if you apply October 1st, your project, you don't want to start anything for your project until January 15th. That's the earliest start date for an October 1st deadline. On February 1st, your earliest start date is May 15th. On April 1st deadline, your earliest start date is July 15th. So keep those dates in mind. If you're planning a summer event to happen in July, well, I would recommend applying for that project October 1st so that you can start the ball rolling and sign contracts and begin advertising and marketing and getting supplies for your project as early as January 15th. And then you have all of that time before your event occurs in July. But if you are applying on April 1st and your event is in July, but you can't start your project until July 15th, I am 99% sure the board isn't going to be comfortable approving your grant project. I can't guarantee, of course, any of that. I don't approve or I don't score the applications, but just know that it will be very difficult for your project to be approved if your event is July 30th and you're applying April 1st. So just consider these start dates. They're going to be important when you're planning out your grant project with us. And then the last column is the project end date. You have approximately a year to complete a grant project when you apply with us. So, but the furthest end date is going to be our following fiscal year. So it's June 30th of that following year end date. So if you apply October 1st and January 15th is your earliest start date, June 30th is the latest end date that you can have for your project. So that actually gives you longer than a year. But if you apply April 1st and your start date is July 15th, you have only, again, still until June 30th to complete your project. So you have a little less time the longer you wait to apply with us. So hopefully that all makes sense. If you have any questions about start and end dates or concerns about this, don't hesitate to reach out to us and we can help you or explain in more detail how the dates are important. If you're applying for essential support grant or the general operating support with the March 1st deadline date, those start and end dates are a little bit different. They are our fiscal year start and end dates. So your general operating or your essentials support grant will begin July 1st and then it will end the following June 30th. So again, any questions, feel free to let us know. All right, I'm going to go into a little more detail here about the amounts and the match requirements for each of our grants. If you apply for the $600 Arts and Cultural Heritage Resiliency Grant, and you do need to be an arts organization located in our region to apply for these funds, there is no match requirement for this particular grant. It's an ongoing deadline. You can apply at any time. It's $600 for of Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund dollars that can benefit your organization, especially if you've been affected by COVID or racial disparities. The grant guidelines walk through what the grant questions are. This is our shortest application. There are 6 questions that you answer in this application. The second application is for $500 to $5,000 and is the Small Art Project Grant application. This grant requires a 50% match from your organization, so a 1-to-1 match with 10% cash match. So what that means, as an example, is if you are requesting $5,000 in grant funds for the Small Art Project Grant, then your organization will also be matching $5,000 towards the project for total project expenses of $10,000. And of that total project expense of $10,000, 10% of that must be cash. So meaning of $10,000, your organization will be contributing at least $1,000 of cash, and the other match amount up to the $5,000, the additional $4,000, that can be in-kind contributions. It can be other grants and contributions towards the project. It does not need to be cash, but just know that you do need a 50% match for the Small Art Project Grant. For the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund grant, the requested amounts that you can, or the amounts you can request, are between $5,000 and $15,000, and this grant requires just the 10% cash match from your organization. So I'll go with a $5,000 amount, again, example. So if you're requesting $5,000 in Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund grants, your organization has to contribute at least 10%. So let's say your total project expenses are $6,000 and you're going to request $5,000 in grant funds, your organization then is matching $1,000, which is more than 10%. So that gives you some wiggle room. Your maximum amount that you would need to request for a $6,000 project would be $600, right? So then you could actually request a little bit more than $5,000 in grant funds. If there's any questions or concerns about how to calculate your cash match requirements and filling out the budget table, which I'll actually show you in a little bit, feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to help you with your budgets for your projects and show you exactly what we need for breakdown in amounts and line items and all of that. So if you're applying for the Essential Support Grant, that was formerly called the General Operating Support for $3,000 to $5,000, there is no match requirement for this grant. Your organization can request $5,000 for General Operating Support to use for the fiscal between the July 1st and June 30th dates for that year period. And going towards general operating expenses such as rent or utilities or membership fees for your board or things like that, insurance expenses. That's what this grant is designed for. Again, I'll just note that the 10% cash match for those grants that I mentioned that require it, it is 10% of the total project budget. So your total project expenses combined, that's where you get your 10% cash match amount from, not from the grant amount request that you're requesting. And it does need to be a cash match, and it is defined as project income. We do not consider in-kind as cash. So again, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us and we'll go into more details about the budget if needed. Okay, when you're applying for a grant with us, the review criteria, again, like I mentioned, it is in full detail in the grant guidelines, so you can dive deeper into each of these definitions, but your grant application will be scored on artistic merit and quality, organizational ability, community need for the project, and equity and inclusion for underrepresented. So just keep these review criteria in mind when you're working on your grant application project and writing your narrative per the project and making sure that you're addressing all of these 4 categories in your narrative. We do have questions in the application that are designed to help you answer these questions and include this information in your narrative. So, but just know that artistic merit and quality, organizational ability, community need for the project, and equity and inclusion are going to be important factors to keep in mind as you're planning and organizing your application. If you're applying for a grant with us and it's the same project from last year, you are able to reapply for grants projects year after year, and we call these repeat project applications. If you're applying for the same project over and over again, make sure that you're including in your application information regarding heightened artistic merit. And describe in your application how the project will expand your organization's artistic capacity or how it will expand your participants or audience's experience with the project. It's going to be really helpful for you to include past outcome evaluation information that may have affected the project moving forward, and or any feedback you would have received from members or audience members or from your community about the project that you can carry forward into your next project. So making sure that your future project and application for a repeat project includes this information is going to be very, very helpful for you in the score for your application. Okay, some of the things to keep in mind when you're working on our applications is that your application is the first impression grant reviewers have of your project. So you want to make sure you're answering all the questions that are being asked in the application. It may be helpful when you are working on an application to go through and read what all of the questions are so that you can space out all of your narrative throughout the application, so that there's not a tendency to put all of the information in the first question space and then later on you are kind of repeating yourself when you're answering some of those questions. So that's something just to keep in mind, or a little tip for you when you are working on the application, that you want to answer the questions that are being asked in the space that is being provided for that answer. So make sure you're answering all of the required questions. As I've mentioned before, there is an asterisk for each of the required questions. And then make sure that your project starts after the earliest start date allowable. If you mention in your narrative at anywhere that your project has already started, it's going to make your project ineligible. So you want to make sure you're planning appropriately for the deadlines of when you're applying and the start dates, the earliest start dates that are allowable for those deadlines. The start date allowable does include committing to spending any money, such as contracting with mentors or purchasing equipment. Make sure your project also ends close to the event for your project, but with enough time after the event so that you can pay all of the project related expenses and that they've cleared the bank within that time period. So typically you want to give yourself maybe a month after your end date to choose your project end date. In your narrative sections of the application, just make sure you're describing what it is exactly that you're proposing to do with your project. Sometimes this involves a timeline of events, that this is going to begin at this time, and then we're going to do this, and then we're going to do this. But research and brainstorming is going to pay off here. Reading through all those grant questions, like I said, answer those questions very thoroughly so that reviewers effectively understand or consider the criteria regarding your project. So when you're answering those questions, keep in mind those 4 criteria that I went over earlier, reference those grant guidelines, and put all of those pieces together in your narrative for each of the questions in the application. Just know how your project is going to impact your organization. And where do you want your organization to be when you're done with the project is going to be helpful information to consider when you're working on your narrative as well. Describe how this project is important to your organization, how you expect it to change your organization. Things like that can also be helpful to include in your narrative. Make sure your narrative tells the same story as the budget. A way for me to explain this, or an example I can think of, is that in your budget, if you're including an equipment purchase, for example, maybe some sound equipment for your stage because you're applying for a grant for musicians and a music series. But in your narrative, you don't describe anything about that equipment or why you need it or the purpose of the equipment. It's possible that the board isn't going to fund that expense for your project because they don't know anything about it. It just showed up in your narrative. So that's what we mean when we say make sure that your narrative tells the same story as the budget. For all of the arts and cultural heritage grant proposals, an outcome evaluation plan is required. So outcome evaluation expenses should also be included in your budget. Some of those expenses may be expenses towards having to print a survey, or if you're going to use an online survey, is there a fee to use an online survey like Monkey? Is there a Monkey survey kind of website? I can't think of the name of it right now, but anyways, is there expenses along with the time it's going to take to compile all of those surveys afterwards and sort through those outcomes? All of that is an expense that is part of the project and should be included in your budget. There is a line item available in the budget template for those expenses. You should also know that if you are applying and including equipment as a part of the budget for your project, just know that equipment necessary for a project's completion may be purchased. However, just purchasing equipment is not considered a project. So you want to have, I'll go back to the example of purchasing sound equipment for a stage. An application where you're only purchasing sound equipment is not a project. It needs to include a performance as well. So you've hired these musicians to perform on such and such of a night. You are purchasing the sound equipment because the sound equipment you have is outdated or no longer compatible with other, who knows, there could be any reason that you're purchasing sound equipment. Maybe you don't have any and you need it for the performance. So just make sure that there's a full project attached to a purchase of the equipment. And then also keep in mind that you're going to report on the results of your project in a final report after everything is completed. So when you are approved for the grant application is approved and you're working on the project and it's all over, you're not quite done yet. You will still need to report to us in your final report what all your actual expenses were. Was your project expenses was successful? You're going to report on all of your outcome evaluation information that you've gathered during your project. That's all part of the final report. Okay, let's get into the budget for your project. Some of the allowable expenses, I'll start with the budget itself is like a double entry accounting system. So your expenses should equal your income for the project. So I'll show you the table in the next slide, but allowable expenses and how we have a breakdown in our budget template are salaries and wages are allowable expense, artist fees, transportation expenses, publicity for your project. If there are rental fees or equipment purchases, expendable supplies and materials for your project can be included as an expense. Any printing or postage that you maybe you're going to send out invitations to your event or print out posters, flyers for the event or advertising. Other expenses, maybe there's some royalty fees or insurance expenses that go along with the project. All of that is allowable expenses. And then on the income side of it, where is the funding coming from for the project? So of course you're requesting grant dollars, so the grant request amount will be part of your income, but where's your local match amount coming from to meet your 10% cash match requirement? And if your total project expenses are are considerably or more than all of those expenses? Is it just cash on hand that your organization is contributing, or maybe you're selling tickets to an event, so the ticket sales is part of your income for the project? Maybe you have other grants or contributions towards your project that you can include as part of your income for the project. So what this is going to look like here is when you're applying for a grant with us, each of the grants have a budget template that looks similar to this. This is the one for the Arts and Cultural Heritage Grant Organization, but they all look similar. So on the very top, that top table is the expenses for your project, and you can see how we've broken that down by line item. So in the first column, you'll be sorting out what grant amount is going towards what. So maybe all of your grant request is going towards artist fees because you're doing a music event, and all of those artist fees are going to the bands that are being hired. So let's say you're requesting $10,000, and that's all going towards artist fees. So that line item under grant funds is going to be $10,000. And then your local match maybe will include publicity expenses for the project and some supplies and materials and outcome evaluation. All of that's going to be contributed by your organization. So you're going to have an amount listed under publicity expenses, line item number 4, in your local match of maybe, let's say publicity $500, and then supplies and materials maybe another $100, and then outcome evaluation another $100, and then maybe there's some rental fees for the tent or something, and that's maybe another $500. So then your local match amount will be calculated there, and then your totals, your total project expenses, that's where you're going to find how much you should be contributing as your organization. So sometimes it's helpful to put all of the expenses together first, find out what the full project expenses are going to be, and then work backwards. You can figure out from your total project expenses how much your organization has to contribute towards the project to meet that 10% cash match requirement. If you have any in-kind expenses, that will increase your local match amount. And then you can figure out exactly how much you can request in grant funds for your project. And then in the income template piece on the very bottom section, that little table, you'll be including if you have earned income for the project towards your towards the local income match. You can put that amount there. If there's other grants or contributions, maybe you have sponsorships from your community that they are contributing to the project, that information, those amounts can go there. Cash from your organization, that can go there. If you have in-kind contributions, that amount, it goes there. And then you'll have a subtotal. That subtotal amount in your local income, project income table should match your local match column above. So if your subtotal is $2,000, then your local match amount in the expense column should also be $2,000. And then the very second to the last row in the income table, the grant request amount you'll include there. So if you're requesting $5,000, your subtotal local match amount is $2,000, then your total income for the project is $7,000, and that will equal your total expenses also of $7,000. Again, if you have questions about how to fill out this budget template, don't hesitate to reach out to us. When you're filling out this budget template too, I would just recommend you're only filling in the totals of these amounts. In your application, if there's details that you're going to include about your artist fees, for example, let's say you're hiring 10 bands, in your narrative of the application, you're going to include a breakdown of what each of those bands is paid. So maybe your artist fees are $10,000, but those 10 bands are each getting $1,000, or maybe they're not all the same amounts. You're going to share that information in a separate space in the application with a total breakdown of each of these expenses. But in this budget table, we only want the total amounts for each line item. Okay, other additional materials to consider when you're applying for us and things that you'll want to make sure you're getting together for your project are all resumes for anyone mentioned in the narrative. So this includes anyone, the project director, maybe if there's any key personnel that's going to be assisting with the project throughout the project period, those people all need to have a resume included and uploaded into the application. Any artists that you're working with, you're going to include artistic resumes for these artists. They are required. If you don't have these resumes, the board is unable to score your application, and it's possible it won't get funded. Artwork samples. There is a space in the application where you can upload samples of work from artists you're working with. I'll go back to the same example I've shared before. If you're working with a band, you can upload a video or YouTube link to a performance of them. There's information in the application and in the grant guidelines about what work samples you can include depending on the type of medium or artist that you're working with. Your board of directors or advisory committee information is required to be included with your application. New this year is if you do not have any board members that are from or living in Region 7E, one of the counties of our region, you want to make sure you have an advisory committee of local members that has some representation of community members from our region. So this is new, but it is highly recommended that when you're applying for us, you upload this information. So your board of directors list needs to include addresses for the board members, or an advisory committee should also be included. If you don't have any advisory committee members or board members from this region, you'll want to include in your narrative why this is the case, why you do not. The project budget, of course, this is required, so that template that I just showed you needs to be uploaded into the application, and then there's a separate section in the application where you'll describe each of those expenses in detail. Supporting materials, if you're purchasing equipment that is more than $500, you need to include price quotes for 3 separate vendors of where you could purchase this equipment, and just explain which vendor you're using and why. It doesn't have to be the most affordable vendor. Maybe it's just because it's a local vendor and that's who you'd like to support or go with. That's fine, but just make sure you are doing your due diligence and researching all more than at least 3 separate vendors for making that equipment purchase and including that in your application. There does also need to be an equipment use plan and uploaded into the application too, so there is a question or a section there for an equipment use plan. Your organization's annual budget, the 1 page of your budget you'll want to upload into the application. There's a signed certification page that's required, as I mentioned before, that needs to have a signature of your project director and an authorized signer for your organization. If you're working with a fiscal sponsor, there needs to be a fiscal sponsor agreement included in your application. If you've applied with us in the past, we used to require you also submit your IRS 501c3 letter of determination 990 or audit material. We are no longer requiring this information, so that is something you do not have to worry about when you're working on an application with us, but these other items are required. If you're working with an artist and they tell you they don't have an artistic resume, that's something that you'll want to help them put together because it is required for your application. So this is just an example of some information that we look for in an artistic resume. If you've never seen one before, you can always Google it, but we do have a sample artistic resume on our website. But some of the information that we look for are an artist statement, any education and training that that artist has had, past employment with their arts related to their job experiences, any readings or publications, performances, exhibitions they've been participated in, awards or collections that they're a part of, mentors they've worked with, residencies they've taken part in, commissions they've received. All of that can be included in their artistic resume. If you're working with a band, a lot of bands have a band bio. Make sure that band bio has what you would normally see in an artistic resume as well. A band bio that's 1 paragraph may not be enough for our board members. You want to make sure there's additional information besides just a paragraph. That information can be for the band and maybe an artistic resume for the band, but make sure it lists all of the band members' names and some of this information about each of those band members, where they've performed, how long have they been together, do they have any CDs released, where have they I already said where they performed, but anyways, if you have any question about artistic resumes, don't hesitate to reach out to us, but we can help you as much as we can. Okay, work samples and description list. So as you're selecting work samples for your application for submission, just remember that their artistic excellence is the primary criteria. So you want a really good work sample of the artist that you're working with. It's important that the sample you submit that represents the artist's work to the best advantage. In general, grant reviewers are not looking for a range of abilities in that artist. They are looking for a cohesive vision for the grant recipient. What I mean by that is if you're working with an artist who works in a plethora of mediums, but you're going to be specifically using them for a painting class and they're going to be teaching painting, then you want to share paintings that that artist has done, not other forms of artwork that they've done. Make it specific to your grant project. There's details of the types of work samples allowable are in the application, and they will depend on the type of art form, of course, that you're working with for the type of work sample that we'll look for. So just follow the instructions in the application for those work samples and you should be just fine. The certification page, I did mention this earlier, but make sure that certification page has the signatures of the project director and the authorized signer for your organization. This is required for all organizations applying for funding with us to have a certification page. It certifies that your board supports your application and that it's an accurate proposal and that you'll carry out your project as described if it is funded. So your board of directors and fiscal agent is legally responsible for this project. So make sure that certification page is signed and uploaded as a PDF into your application. Okay. All of that information was in regards to the application itself, but what happens after you submit your application? So after the deadline date and your application is submitted, at that time, staff becomes monitors of your proposal. So we are required at that point to inform you when the grant reviewers are going to be looking at your application. We will invite you to the grant review. We cannot accept any updates or additional information about your application after it's been submitted, after that deadline date passes. A side note to this is if you happen to submit your application, let's say 3 days before the deadline, and you realize you uploaded the wrong document in one of the sections, feel free to reach out to us because we can unsubmit an application so you can work on it again and resubmit it before the deadline. So that is a possibility, but after that deadline dates and you've passed and you've submitted your application, we can no longer accept any changes or help you with making changes to your application. Staff can no longer assist you with your application or tell you what issues there may be after that deadline passes. So we can now only talk to you about when the grant review is scheduled. We do invite you to the grant review. Like I said, we encourage you to attend, but it's not required. But if you do attend, you'll find out that night if your application was approved or not. And then just keep in mind that these are competitive grant programs. So we hope that you can attend them and we wish you good luck with your application. Of course, we want all of these projects to be funded. So after funding is approved, let's say, so if your grant proposal is approved, at that point what happens is we send out what we call a notification of grant award, an NGA, and a request for payment. This is sent via email. It's an electronic document that will be signed by us. Our signature will be there. Our executive director signs it. Your project director will sign it, and your authorized signer for your organization will sign it. So within 45 days, you can sign this document stating that you're going to accept the grant award. Once you've signed and submitted this document back to us, you'll have an electronic copy of the grant contract. The notification of grant award contract will be available to you. And then we'll process your grant check and we meet with you, what we call grant management training. Once a year, every organization who receives a grant from us has this grant management training. And at that point, we just talk to you about what to expect during the project period, what to think of or keep in mind for your final report, where to find all of that information. So those are some of the things we talk about. We talk about any changes that may happen to your project and how do you submit a change request for your grant. When you apply for a grant with us and it's been approved and you sign that contract, we expect that your grant proposal is going to be executed exactly as you say it was going to be. But we also understand that changes happen. Maybe event dates need to change, or you have an artist who all of a sudden can no longer participate in your grant activities and you need to replace them with another artist. All of that is a possibility. So the way you can make those changes to your grant project are through grant change requests. So there's a whole section on our website about how to submit a change request. If there's budget changes, any budget line item changes more than 20% also need to be submitted as a change request for your project. So I know this is a lot of information, but hopefully it's helpful as you're gathering and putting together your project and thinking and considering about applying for a grant with us. But again, this information is also on our website too, so hopefully it's helpful there. But Once your project's approved as well, when you are advertising or putting out a press release or printing out posters or flyers or posting information to Facebook, also make sure you're including the funding credit line and logos for your grant project. This information is included in your contract, but there's a funding credit line that you'll use in all of your publicity and promotion for the project, along with those logos and hashtags if you're using social media. Okay, in conclusion, we're near the end, folks. So in conclusion, make sure you're using the correct grant form for the application that you want to apply for. All of our applications are submitted through our grant portal and are available, like I said, 4 to 6 weeks before the deadline date. But all of the information about our grants can be found on our website, so feel free to look at that website anytime. Feel free to have a friend read your rough draft of your application, read through it many times, request a grant review from us. That's what we're here for, to help you with your applications. It doesn't guarantee funding of your grant if we read through it and give you feedback, but it certainly doesn't hurt. Keep in mind all of those timelines and start and end dates that I mentioned when you're working and planning on your grant application. All grant timelines are included in the grant guidelines as well if you need to reference those. If you'd like to review past successful grant applications, you're welcome to make an appointment and come in and look through those grant hard copies of grant applications that have been successful in the past. Just make sure you call in advance to make sure that we are available in those and there is time for you to look through them. Excuse me. If you have any questions, as I mentioned, feel free to reach out to us, send an email, give us a call. This is our contact information here. You can reach me at 320-591-7034. You can send an email to grantinfo@ecrac.org. That's grantinfo@ecrac.org. Our website is www.ecrac.org. We do have a small staff, so if you feel like stopping in and talking to us in person, just make sure you're calling in advance, making sure that we're going to be here in our office and available to meet with you. We'd be happy to do that, but just give us a call and a heads up before you swing by. The gallery space is also available if you happen to be in the Hinckley area and you want to come through and check out our permanent art collection. Please do so. It's a beautiful, beautiful works of art that we have, and we're happy to host you to walk through our gallery. One final note, this activity is made possible with funds provided by the McKnight Foundation and also by the voters of Minnesota, thanks to legislative appropriations from both the General Fund and the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. Thanks again for listening. If you're still here for this grant info session, it's been a pleasure. If you have questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us, and I hope you have a great day. Thanks.